I began this large-scale sculpture with a scale model, which means 1 inch translates to 1 foot. The welder, my friend Shen Cheng, then figured out the steel frame that would support the sculpture itself. I then needed about 60 feet of steel, which seemed like a lot until I entered the warehouse and realized just how small my order actually was. We then cut steel and welded for hours, starting with the base itself. Think of the steel frame as a type of skeleton. It needs to support the entire weight of the sculpture, like a human skeleton would, or the framing of a house. To prevent rust, I coated it with primer and then protective enamel. I even drilled holes so that it could be anchored directly into the ground. Cutting steel mesh isn't particularly fun, but I needed the mesh to hold the concrete into the base so it did not fall through. Once the base was ready, I could start cutting out the foam. I used a drywall knife and freehanded it based upon the model. I never copy a model precisely. I like to make changes as the sculpture evolves. I feel copies from models often look stiff and a little bit too formal. The interior foam went pretty quickly. However, the exterior pieces that had to fit in between the steel, those were a bit of a challenge. And I really began to have daydreams about CNC and Illustrator files. And oddly enough, I only had 1 sheet of tracing paper left. Classic. And I had to really make that piece of paper work. I was glad to use up this foam. A lot of it was donated, but it really makes a mess. The foam then needed to be wrapped in chicken wire to prepare it for the marble aggregate and concrete application. You have to make sure it's really held tightly against the foam. It can't be loose and just hanging out. My stone carving practice creates a lot of rubble, so I crush it down into aggregate and recycle it into new sculptures. This is actually my first large-scale sculpture using the recycled marble. I needed a mixture that wasn't too watery, something that I could easily apply vertically so that it wouldn't slide down the surface of the sculpture. So my friend Quinn and I made small batches and applied it by hand. Details like the rachis were built out, and then I used trowel work to create more of a textured surface. Since the mixture dries quickly, we had to work quickly, but we were still doing this all by hand and it took over 7 hours. I'm surprised we're still smiling. I try to use up various supplies in the studio, so I had to use a concrete binder to bind the various types of concrete and cover the remaining steel. I again mixed in the marble aggregate, but then I kept out little pieces so that I could sign the sculpture with my initials, JB. The detailing and trowel work left some rough edges, so I sanded those off and then prepared to paint. So I first sealed it, and then I did waterproofing paint in addition to the sealant. Dry brushing some metallic paint would give it just a little bit of sparkle in the sunlight versus a flat acrylic finish. My friend Mike, with his mastery of ratchet straps and forklifts, moved the sculpture out of the studio.
Clear. Woo! Like an inch.
Vane then traveled in style to the Wicker Park Bucktown neighborhood of Chicago. And Terry and Ted took over with their installation expertise. Having installed quite a few large-scale sculptures at this point, I consider a truck with a boom crane a thing of beauty. Shifted into place and bolted into the ground, Vane was ready for public display.